When I married Daniel 3 years ago, I thought I had found my forever. He was steady, responsible, and carried a quiet strength that made me feel safe. Widowed for nearly a decade, he had raised his only son, Ethan, alone. I admired the bond they shared, and I promised myself I would never try to replace Ethan's mother, only to be a supportive presence in his life. Ethan was 20 when I first met him, tall, well-mannered, and surprisingly mature for his age. He greeted me with a polite smile and a respectful handshake, yet there was something in his eyes I couldn't quite read. Over time, I chalked it up to the awkwardness of adjusting to a new family dynamic. Our household ran smoothly in the beginning. Daniel worked long hours as a project manager, often leaving early and returning late. I understood it was his way of ensuring we lived comfortably, but it meant I spent a lot of evenings alone in the quiet house. Ethan, busy with university classes, was in and out, but whenever he was home, he was unfailingly kind. He'd carry groceries in without being asked, fix a squeaky cabinet door, or ask how my day had been. At first, I appreciated his attentiveness as nothing more than basic courtesy, but the little things began to stand out. If I mentioned craving something sweet, he'd return the next day with my favorite chocolate. If I was working in the garden, he'd come out to help, even if it meant abandoning whatever he'd been doing. Daniel rarely noticed these small acts. He was too consumed with deadlines and late-night emails. One evening, a week before my birthday, Ethan knocked on the door of my study. In his hands was a small box wrapped in silver paper. "I know it's early," he said, "but I saw this and thought of you." Inside was a delicate silver bookmark, engraved with a floral design. I was touched not just because it was beautiful, but because it was something personal. Ethan had remembered a passing comment I'd made months ago about how I loved the feel of a real book in my hands. That night, as I lay in bed beside Daniel, who was already asleep, my mind kept drifting back to the gesture. It wasn't extravagant, but it had meaning. I told myself not to read into it. Ethan was just thoughtful. Still, I couldn't ignore the way my heart had lifted when he handed me the gift. I tried to push the feeling aside, but a seed had been planted, one I didn't want to acknowledge. I reminded myself that I was his stepmother, that Daniel trusted me, that this was just a kind, young man being considerate. And yet, as I closed my eyes, I felt an unfamiliar restlessness take root. I didn't know it then, but that small silver bookmark would be the first page of a story I could never unwrite. Daniel's workload seemed to grow heavier with each passing month. Business trips became routine, and entire weekends slipped by without his presence in the house. I told myself I understood he was providing for us, but deep down, I began to resent the silence his absence left behind. Ethan, on the other hand, was around more often. His university classes were mostly online now, which meant our paths crossed throughout the day. Sometimes it was over breakfast, where he'd make coffee just the way I liked it. Other times it was in the living room late at night, when I'd be half asleep on the couch, and he'd appear with a blanket to drape over my shoulders. One evening, heavy rain pattered against the windows, and the power flickered before plunging us into darkness. Daniel was away, on another trip, unreachable. I lit a candle, and Ethan joined me in the kitchen. We sat across from each other, talking in the dim, golden light. The conversation drifted from light-hearted topics to more personal ones: his childhood, the day he lost his mother, the way he sometimes felt invisible in his father's world. I listened, really listened, in a way Daniel rarely did for me anymore. His voice softened, and for a moment, I saw not my stepson, but a young man carrying more weight than his years should demand. When he finished speaking, I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. It was a simple gesture, meant to comfort, but neither of us moved to end it. From that night forward, something shifted. I caught myself paying more attention to the sound of his footsteps in the hall, the way his smile seemed to linger when our eyes met. I began choosing clothes in the morning with more thought, without fully admitting to myself why. A week later, we were on the couch watching an old comedy film. A funny scene made me laugh harder than I had in months, and as I leaned forward, my hand brushed against his. It was nothing, an accident, But neither of us pulled away right away. Instead, there was a quiet pause, a shared glance that seemed to hold an unspoken question neither dared to voice. The air between us had changed, and I could feel it in every small interaction after that. How close he'd stand beside me in the kitchen, how his voice lowered when we spoke alone. It wasn't just politeness anymore. It was something heavier, unacknowledged, but impossible to ignore. One night, as he passed me in the hallway, Ethan murmured, "I wish things were different." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask, but the words stayed with me, echoing in a place I didn't want to explore. I should have stepped back then, drawn a clear line. Instead, I found myself wondering what exactly he had meant and why a part of me hoped I already knew. The following week brought a kind of quiet I couldn't shake. Daniel had left for yet another 3-day conference, and I moved through the house feeling both restless and strangely expectant. I told myself I was imagining things, that Ethan's hallway comment meant nothing, but the truth was, I didn't believe that. That Friday afternoon, I received a message from Daniel. "Sorry, can't make it home tomorrow. Big client meeting." It was supposed to be our anniversary weekend. I stared at the screen until my eyes blurred, the disappointment hitting harder than I wanted to admit. Ethan found me later, sitting on a back porch, nursing a mug of tea that had long gone cold. "You okay?" he asked, leaning casually against the doorway, but his tone carried genuine concern. I managed a weak smile. "Just a little let down, that's all." Without pressing, he offered, "Come for a walk. The park will be quiet this time of day." I hesitated, but the thought of being alone in the house felt heavier than I could bear. The air outside was crisp, the faint scent of pine hanging in the breeze. We walked side by side, our conversation drifting from light chatter to personal confessions. Ethan spoke of feeling like he was always second in his father's life, of how he'd learned to hide disappointment. I recognized the ache in his voice because it mirrored my own. At the edge of the park, where the path wound beneath an arch of old oak trees, he stopped. "I don't know if I should say this," he began, eyes fixed on the ground, "but I can't keep pretending I don't care more than I should." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind rattling the leaves overhead. My pulse quickened, every logical thought telling me to end the conversation here and walk away. But I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just looked at him, searching his face for something, maybe a reason to justify the feeling I'd been avoiding. He stepped closer, close enough for me to catch the warmth of his breath in the cool evening air. His hand lifted, brushing a loose strand of hair from my face. It was such a small, gentle motion, but it carried the weight of everything we hadn't said. I could have ended it then. I could have reminded him and myself of where the boundaries were. Instead, I let the moment linger, my silence answering the question he hadn't directly asked. When we returned home, we didn't speak of what had happened, but something had shifted irreversibly. I no longer saw him only as my stepson, and I could no longer claim innocence in the closeness that had formed between us. In the quiet of my room that night, I admitted what I had been denying for weeks. I wasn't sure I wanted to stop. The days that followed felt heavier, as if the air in the house carried an unspoken truth neither of us dared name. We didn't cross any obvious lines, but the distance between what we were and what we were becoming was paper thin. Every glance felt loaded, every casual touch lingered a fraction too long. Daniel returned from his trip late one night, and I was startled by how strange it felt to see him. His presence didn't erase what had happened. It only made the contrast sharper. While he unpacked his suitcase and updated me on work, I found myself nodding at the right moments, but barely absorbing his words. My mind was elsewhere, and I hated myself for it. Over the next week, I noticed Daniel watching me more closely. He'd glance up from his coffee and catch me lost in thought. Once, I found him standing in the doorway of the living room, eyes flicking between me and Ethan with a subtle tension I couldn't ignore. One evening, after Ethan left to meet friends, Daniel asked, "Is there something you're not telling me?" The question was direct, but his voice was careful. My stomach tightened. 100 responses raced through my mind, yet I chose the safest. "No, why would there be?" He studied me for a moment before letting it drop, but I knew the seed of suspicion had been planted. That night, I lay awake long after Daniel fell asleep. The thrill I had once felt around Ethan was now tangled with guilt, fear, and the awareness of how fragile the life I'd built had become. I could almost hear the ticking clock on this secret, counting down to a moment when it might explode into the open. The next morning, I made a decision, not because I suddenly found strength, but because I realized what was at stake. I told Ethan we needed to stop spending so much time together, that we had to put distance between us. His expression hardened, but he didn't argue. "If that's what you want," he said, though his voice carried the sting of disappointment. The house felt emptier after that. We still exchanged polite words at the dinner table, but the ease we once shared was gone. Daniel seemed relieved by the calmer air between us, though I could tell he sensed something had changed, something I'd never confess. In the quiet moments, I replayed everything in my mind, the looks, the conversations, the silver bookmark that had started it all. I told myself I had done the right thing by stepping back, but I also knew it was far too late to pretend I hadn't crossed a line. Betrayal doesn't always happen in a single dramatic act. Sometimes it's a slow drift, a series of choices you convince yourself are harmless, until one day you look back and see how far you've gone. And no matter how far you walk away, afterward, a part of you never truly comes back.